The foundation of medieval thought were the works of ancient Greece and Rome. These were pre-Christian texts, but medieval thinkers used them in new, Christian-approved ways. The medieval education system was made up of the studies of the Bible, theology, and the division of studies between the liberal and the practical arts was made by the Greco-Romans. Liberal comes from the Latin word liberalis, which means free. Therefore, the liberal arts were the studies that ought to be undertaken by free men, while the practical arts were technical vocations. The ancients identified 7 liberal arts, which were subdivided into 2 groups. The trivium consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. The quadrivium were mathematical, including arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. The linguistic disciplines of the trivium were necessary for the quadrivium, and were therefore considered trivial. The ancients produced appropriate textbooks for these disciplines that were still used in the Middle Ages. The most famous of these were those by Aristotle on logic. The Roman Boethius collected 6 of Aristotle's works on logic and translated them into Latin. This collection became known as the Organon, or Tool. Boethius was a scholar on his own merits as well, as he wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, an expert discussion of Neoplatonism. In addition to translations, late classical authors also produced summaries of ancient thought collected together. The collections composed by Martianus Capella, Cassiodorus, and Isidore of Seville were all used in the Middle Ages. These compendiums were clearly simplified versions of longer, more complicated works, and medieval scholars gradually became aware of all that they didn't know. Around 1000, some European scholars became aware that Muslims in Spain and Sicily had translated many of these entire works into Arabic. Gerbert of Aurillac traveled to Spain and met with Jewish and Arabic scholars there who were able to give him access to these works. The Jews were particularly helpful as intermediaries, since they traveled between Christians and Muslims as merchants, and were often trilingual and could interpret for them. Throughout the course of the 12th century, Christians traveled to Muslim lands to translate Aristotle into Latin from Arabic. Although imperfect, these efforts greatly increased demand for Aristotle, and sparked interest in translating Aristotle into Latin directly from Greek. The Greek texts had been preserved by the Byzantines, and would shortly be translated into Latin. Prior to this movement to translate Aristotle into Latin, his teacher Plato had been the most significant ancient philosopher. Only one of Plato's works, however, had been translated into Latin. This was the Timaeus, which described the creation of the world, and it was frequently used in comparison to the Genesis account. During the 12th century, 2 more works of Plato's were translated into Latin, the Meno and Phaedo. Plato's popularity couldn't stand up to the challenge of Aristotle, though, because he wrote on a few selected topics, whereas Aristotle taught in every possible area. Most medieval scholars significantly disagreed with some of Aristotle's conclusions, but his methods would be adopted, to the point where he was so well known in the 13th century as to be referred to as simply the philosopher. One of Aristotle's ideas that met with the greatest resistance among medieval scholars was his insistence that the world had always existed and had never been created. Because Europeans first re-encountered Aristotle within an Arabic context, the commentaries that medieval Muslims had written had an influence on European intellectual development. The most significant of these men was Averroes, although Al-Farabi and Avicenna also made their contributions. Maimonides was an influential Jewish intellectual at the time, whose work Guide for the Perplexed tried to find a middle ground of agreement between reason and revelation. You will hopefully recall that Charlemagne in the 9th century made a push to increase educational opportunities by opening monastic schools. This was expanded upon in the 12th century, when a number of schools were opened for the training of clergy, and they were known as cathedral schools. The learning taking place in these and other educational institutions would explode into the 12th century Renaissance. This is the second of the 3 Renaissances covered in this course. The first was the Carolingian, and the later one is the Italian Renaissance. One of the features of a Renaissance is its focus on re-emphasizing the study of Greco-Roman classics. At about this time, the first universities were founded, although they differed in a number of significant ways from our modern universities. In these first institutions, teachers and students formed guilds that negotiated over curriculum, tuition, and room and board. There were no dorms, but students had to negotiate with townspeople for these items. In fact, the Latin word universitas simply means guild, and reminds us of the origin of these structures. These universities didn't have permanent locations either. They existed wherever scholars taught together and students congregated to learn. Because they weren't permanent, they could move, which helped in the negotiation process with locals. Universities could be a boon to the local economy. Kings also became involved in early universities, because they churned out scholars who had the skills kings looked for in bureaucrats and counselors. The first universities were located in Bologna and Paris. Oxford was next, and formed when a group who broke away from Paris traveled across the Channel to England. The first degrees were proof that a scholar had attended the university and mastered the requirements of the Guild of Teachers. Eventually, of course, these institutions did acquire buildings and permanent locations. Robert de Sorbonne provided the buildings for the University of Paris in 1257. At first, these were essentially dormitories, places where students who could live who couldn't afford to live elsewhere. Over time, they became convenient places to hold class, and thus added instructional apparatus. The earliest universities offered 4 courses of instruction: the liberal arts, law, medicine, and theology. The liberal arts was introductory, and the latter 3 were advanced degrees. Most of the early universities only offered 1 or maybe 2 of these degrees. Law was further subdivided, as we have seen, into civil or Roman law and church or canon law. The instruction would go like this. The teacher would stand at the front of the class and read from one of the established classical textbooks. Periodically, he would stop and explain or add his commentary about the text. Over time, these commentaries would be recorded, written in the margins of texts, and ultimately considered material for study on its own merits. These commentaries were known as glosses. As I mentioned several lessons ago, Justinian's Code was the textbook for legal studies, and students generally used Gratian's Decretum as a supplement to this text. Medical studies were based off the work of the Roman physician Galen. The most popular textbook for theology was Peter Lombard's Sentences, which provided an outline of every topic a theologian ought to be able to master. Theology was considered by these universities to be the most honored degree, and was called the Queen of the Faculties, although it had fewer students than other programs, since the other offerings had better career potentials. Of all the teachers of the 12th century, none was more famous or infamous than Peter Abelard, who was one of the key figures involved in bringing renown to the theological faculty of the University of Paris. Abelard's key text was Sic et Non, which is translated into yes and no. The English scholar Anselm of Canterbury had used logic to demonstrate the existence of God, sparking an interest in how far logic could go. Abelard used logic in his text to resolve seeming contradictions within the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers. Not all of the faculty appreciated the use of logic in theology, and the popular charismatic Abelard also made a number of enemies, among those more conservative than he. His enemies eventually brought his ideas before a church court and had them condemned without allowing Abelard to fully defend himself. Perhaps more famous, if less significant, was his relationship with Heloise. Heloise's uncle hired Abelard to be her personal tutor. They secretly married, but when the news broke of their relationship, Heloise's family had him castrated. Abelard retired to a monastery, and Heloise to a convent. Although unpopular at first, Abelard's logical methods of scholarship eventually won out. This process, known as scholasticism, ultimately became the standard tool in theological study. Philosophy, and in particular the application of logic, became known as the handmaiden of theology. The best example of the scholastic method was the grandiose work of St. Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican monk, which is titled the Summa Theologica. The purpose of this work was to reconcile faith and reason. It would become the foundation of medieval theology. Perhaps the most significant example of Aquinas' philosophical method has to do with his understanding of the doctrine of transubstantiation, which is what was supposed to have taken place during communion. Aquinas used Aristotle's categories of substance and accident to resolve the seeming contradiction that the wine of communion appeared to be wine even after consecration. The philosophical answer to this was that while the accidents of the wine remained, the substance of the wine had been transformed into the blood of Christ. Thus, philosophy could be used to answer theological questions. One of the great debates within the world of scholasticism in the universities during the 12th century was between nominalism and realism. Realists believed that when you use a word, there is a reality that connects the name of an object with that object. A chair must be a chair. The realists were influenced by the Platonic doctrine of forms. Their opponents were the nominalists, who maintained that words are simply symbols that represent an object, and there is no necessary connection between the two. Nominalists gained their name from the Latin word nomina, meaning word. The debate between these two groups centered on the nature of words and reality. The most famous nominalist was William of Ockham, who developed a logical method known as Occam's razor. This principle would be important for the later scientific method, and essentially stated that the best statement of the truth of something was that which could do so with the fewest number of different elements. Occam didn't dare use the razor on Christian doctrine, but rather on certain tendencies among scholastics to develop long, complicated arguments. His teaching would later be condemned because of these criticisms of scholasticism. Medieval political theory can be generalized into two categories. The first is that which tended to look at society as an organic element. The nation is the human body, derived in part from the writings of St. Paul. In these metaphors, the king is the head of the body, the nobility the arms, and the people make up the body of the state. John of Salisbury is perhaps the most famous advocate of this analysis. Another political theory that developed in the Middle Ages was derived from the conciliar movement discussed last lesson. Marsilius of Padua wrote The Defender of the Peace, which argued that authority comes from the people. During the arguments surrounding conciliarism, this was used to oppose the power of the the power of the Pope in favor of councils, but could also be applied to the secular state. I've already mentioned the importance of Gerbert of Aurillac, who brought a number of Greek works back into European readership by bringing them from Muslim Spain. He would also benefit Europe by introducing so-called Arabic numerals into Christian mathematics. His example would also inspire many others to translate ancient texts, some valuable, some not. This revitalization of scientific study would have a number of consequences on technology as well. Compasses began to be used by European navigators to determine direction around 1100. The astrolabe was also reintroduced to Europe, after its use and usefulness were made clear by translated Arabic documents. Roger Bacon and Robert Grosseteste began to use this knowledge to begin the foray into experimental science. Bacon, for example, discovered the formula for gunpowder, allowing this ancient Chinese invention to be used to devastating effect in the 100 Years' War. His influence was clear on Albert the Great, who began to investigate nature by means of careful observation. This emphasis on observation would lead to advances in optics, and ultimately could be used for corrective vision. Other thinkers rejected observation in favor of logical experimentation. The French intellectuals Jean Buridan and Nicole Rame developed a new theory of motion in contradiction to Aristotle's, which they termed impetus, through logical deduction. Another technological invention of the period is the mechanical clock. Also significant was the important and later development of paper. Remember that Europeans used parchment to write on, which was expensive and dependent on a supply of animal skins. Paper was much more cheap to manufacture and could be made out of mashed up, used cloths, which were plentiful. Paper became the standard writing surface when the printing press was developed around 1450. Latin was the universal language of Europe during the Middle Ages. It was a language spoken in church and used in universities. Nevertheless, during the High Middle Ages, the first literary works written in vernacular languages began to be produced. The Anglo-Saxon conquerors of Britain had their own literary tradition, and had even translated the Bible into it. The major Anglo-Saxon epic was Beowulf, which describes Beowulf's quest to vanquish a series of terrible beasts. The Norman conquest introduced the French language and French words into the language, transforming it into what linguists call Middle English. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is the most famous work of this era. It is a collection of short stories told by a group of pilgrims on their way to Canterbury to pass the time. By far the most famous work of Old French is the Song of Roland. This work was composed in the early 12th century, but describes the 9th century exploits of Charlemagne's soldiers in their Spanish campaign. The French also developed chansons de geste, songs of deeds, which are poetic songs portraying knights acting gallantly. The essence of it became known as chivalry. One of the core elements of chivalric literature is romantic love, in which the hero falls in love with a heroine who is often already married to someone else. The tales of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table furnished themes for French chivalric romances for centuries. The Romance of the Rose was a 13th century allegorical poem by Guillaume de Lorry and Jean de Meun that depicted the various vices and virtues. The first works written in Spanish tended to center on epics associated with the Reconquista, such as the legends of El Cid. German literature, like French, of this period often wrote about the Arthurian legends. The most popular were the Percival story told in Parsifal by Wolfram von Eschenbach, and Tristan and Isolde by Gottfried von Strasbourg. Other German literature took themes from pre-Christian times, such as the Nibelungenlied, the Songs of the Nibelungs, which had been based on Scandinavian sagas. Viking literature wasn't recorded until after the conversion to Christianity brought literacy. The Old Norse legends of the Younger Edda and the Elder Edda are a series of prose and poetic recollections of Norse mythology. Snorri Sturluson composed the prose Younger Edda. Of all the vernacular literatures developing in the High Middle Ages, the most comprehensive took place in Italy, where a trio of authors created lasting achievements of Italian literature. The first of these was Dante Alighieri. His Divine Comedy is an epic poem describing hell, purgatory, and heaven in a journey explored by Dante and his guide Virgil, the Roman epic poet. In addition to exploring general themes of good and evil, and the reasons people are spending eternity in heaven, purgatory, and hell, this work provides an interesting interpretation of the history of Western civilization. Dante also wrote a series of love poems in honor of Beatrice, who just so happens to also be his guide through heaven. The second knight of Italian literature was Francesco Petrarch, who wrote popular works in Italian alongside his treatises written in Latin. Perhaps most significantly, he wrote love poems for a woman named Laura in a new form that would later be codified as a sonnet. The third crown of Italy was Giovanni Boccaccio. He wrote the Decameron, a series of 100 stories told by 10 young men and women on 10 consecutive days. Although rather bawdy, they reveal quite a bit about contemporary Italian society, as well as quite a bit about the Black Death, the plague striking Italy that provided the context for the storytelling. In 1347, an unknown disease struck most of Europe that would become known as the Black Death. This disease has been identified as the bubonic plague, but it may have been a combination of different epidemics. The first appearance of this disease lasted through 1351, but would recur periodically until the 1700s. Bubonic plague is spread by fleas that carry the disease, biting humans instead of the rats that they normally lived on. The disease is endemic to Central Asia, but was carried from there to Italy by Italian merchants who were trading the Black Sea. The speed with which the plague traveled through Europe shows the extent to which commerce had connected Europe with Asia by this point. These trade routes between Europe and Asia had been opened up by Italian merchants like the famed Marco Polo in the 14th century. Polo wrote about his experiences in his memoir titled Travels. It would appear as if the Black Death appeared in Constantinople, then Italy, before spreading all throughout Europe. Italy, France, Spain, England, and Germany were devastated. Only Poland and a few other Eastern European areas were spared the worst of the ravages, largely because of their low level of connectedness with the rest of Europe. Over the 4 years of the plague, a third of Europeans would die. Some areas experienced 50% population loss. Europeans had little idea how it was spread, which made the disease that much more dangerous and terrifying. Doctors failed to identify its cause or stop its spread, at times leading to panic. Many people felt that the plague was a punishment sent by God for the sins of the people. One of the ways that this expressed itself was the flagellant movement, people who traveled from town to town whipping themselves in public in acts of contrition. One of the contributing factors for the devastation of the plague were the series of famines that struck Europe in the early years of the 14th century. In a previous lesson, I mentioned the warming of the climate that had a positive impact on agriculture around the year 1000. Now, the climate began to cool, and the growing season shortened. This led to a reduction in food output. The worst of these famines lasted from 1315 to 1317, and led to the death of a significant number of people. These events checked population growth that Europe had been experiencing since the beginning of the High Middle Ages, around the year 1000. In addition, the chronic malnutrition that many Europeans suffered through earlier in the century left them immunodeficient and more likely to fall victim to the plague. As you can imagine, in the short term, the Black Death caused an immediate economic collapse as businesses fell apart. In the long term, however, the net benefit was a benefit to workers, because so many people had died that the demand for labor outstripped supply. Previously, the supply had dwarfed demand, meaning that workers were expendable commodities. The price of food also dropped, since fewer mouths needed food, and supply was able to meet that demand. Workers could now make demands on employers, such as higher wages, although these were resisted and led to a series of peasant uprisings. I made a passing reference when discussing the 100 Years' War a few lessons ago, that both England and France had to deal with peasant uprisings, and the economic and social effects of the plague were a contributing factor to these. In France, the major uprising was known as the Jacquerie, while Wat Tyler led the Peasants' Revolt in England. Coinciding with the rise of towns and growth of commerce in the High Middle Ages was the development of new architectural styles in church building. The first of these was the Romanesque, which predominated in the 11th and 12th centuries. Romanesque means Roman-like, because these buildings used the major features of Latin construction, the rounded arch and barrel vault. The addition of a prominent tower was new in the Romanesque period. These churches had very high ceilings, which necessitated thick walls with small windows. The result was a dark, close interior. These churches often featured sculptures of religious themes. The sculpture of this period tended to depict otherworldly attributes. Demons and beasts were common. Monastic orders in particular appreciated the Romanesque style of architecture. The Gothic style of church architecture can be dated to the 1140s in France. That is when Abbé Suger introduced the concepts that would characterize Gothic style in his church at Saint-Denis, just outside Paris. From that point on, the greatest cathedrals built in Northern Europe in the 13th century tended to be Gothic. The Gothic style had more necessary features than the Romanesque, and the commonalities between Gothic churches are readily observable. The most significant are the transition from the rounded arch to the pointed arch, and the use of much larger stained glass windows that flooded the buildings with light. Because larger windows meant fewer, thinner walls, the walls on their own didn't support the weight of the church's ceiling. To reinforce the walls, buttresses were built a distance away from the walls that held up the church's ceiling. Rose windows were also a common feature, which were ornate, circular stained glass constructions. Because of all the light and the thinness of the walls, Gothic churches appear substantially lighter than Romanesque structures. They also tended to be more decorated, and were generally covered with detailed features such as symbols and gargoyles. Another artistic transition that is associated with the term Gothic has to do with handwriting. New letter forms that were more elaborate and closely connected were designed, and are known as Gothic minuscule. It is also sometimes called black letter type. These are the letters used by Johannes Gutenberg when he created the typeface for his printing press. Later Italian scholars returned to the easier-to-read Carolingian minuscule, which they mistakenly thought was from ancient Rome, not early medieval Europe. Gothic type was attacked by humanists for its lack of clarity, and this negative attribution has stuck with it. Frescoes, which I discussed back when I talked about Roman artistic styles, were used to decorate the walls of medieval churches. By far the most common art form of the medieval period, however, were designs in the margins of the text produced during the period. They are variously called illuminations, which is derived from illustration, or miniatures, because minium, lead oxide, was the pigment, not because they were small. At first, these illustrations were abstract designs integrated into the margins of texts. But over time, more detailed drawings, not usually related to the text at hand, were included along the edges. Oftentimes, these were fantastic creatures, dragons, beasts, etc., known as drolleries. Another common practice was to include an oversized capital letter at the top of the page that was filled in with pictures. These were called historiated initials. The most famous fresco painter of the medieval period, and a key figure in the transition towards the Renaissance style, was Giotto. Two of his frescoes are reproduced here below for you. Giotto introduced three major innovations. First, he attempted to portray his figures with intense emotions, rather than a placid indifference or eternality. Second, he began to move towards three-dimensionality by placing his figures in a setting. He also began to produce more realistic figures by combining these two previous features.